Hey everyone. Welcome back to Strange Mind 6. I'm your host Ruby, and today we are going to be getting back into Beware the Claws That Catch Alice by Christina Henry. And we last left off at the ending of chapter 8, where Cheshire went ahead and let them go through a different door, which, come to find out, it was a maze. So now they have to go ahead and find their way out of this maze. And Alice is getting fed up with it. She's tired of people calling her a magician, which, let's face it, it seems that she is. But without further ado, my dear friends, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and grab a drink, grab a snack, or sit back and relax. And let's get into this. Beware the Claws That Catch Alice by Christina Henry. Chapter 9. Thorns pricked at her skin everywhere, poked at her face and hands and the top of her head, and she wormed through her jacket and pants. She thought Hatcher yelled her name, but she couldn't tell. The roses were in her ears and her nose, and under her eyelids, crawling inside her. She opened her mouth to scream, and roses pushed their way inside, choking her. Stop, 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 stop. She wished she were a magician. She would make the roses go away, get them out of this maze, fly away from the old city forever, and forget about the Jabberwocky, and the rabbit, and Cheshire, and the walrus, and Mr. Carpenter, and roses, everything that could make her scared or cry or bleed. She would make the roses burn to the ground so that they could never hurt anyone again. Her hands were hot, hot with her own blood, running from the thorn pricks in her arms down over her palms, and suddenly there was smoke and a sound like a million tiny creatures squealing. Then the thorns were yanked from her skin, and the flowers crawled away from her throat and nose and ears and eyes, and something pushed hard into her back, and she was out, flat on the grass, and crying, and spitting rose petals from her mouth. Alice! Alice! Hatcher's voice, and then Hatcher's hands all over her, patting and soothing, and then Hatcher's arms taking her into his lap, rocking her as she cried and cried and cried. All the strength she thought she'd found was gone now, smashed beneath the rose's assault. Hatcher rubbed his hand down her back and said, Alice, my Alice, don't cry. I can't stand for you to cry. I I want to go home, she said. Her tongue tasted like salt and roses. Where's home, my Alice? Hatcher said. Where's home? We don't have a home, you and I. Then I want to go back to the hospital, she said. We were safe there. Nothing can hurt us. Nothing could grab us and take us away. Except the doctors, Hatcher said, or the medicine they gave us. Our own memories. We weren't safe there, Alice. It was an illusion, and the hospital burned down. There's nowhere for us to go back to. We can go forward. We can find a way out." She cried harder because she knew what he said was true. They had nowhere to go and no safe place to be, and they were trapped in this labyrinth by a whim of a madman. "How do we even know where the way out is?" she said. "How do we know that Cheshire won't keep us here, running in circles forever?" "We don't. We don't know," Hatcher said. "I do know this. You're a magician, as sure as I'm mad." "Not now, Hatch," she said. She was tired and scared and not up to fighting about this. "Look," he said, taking her chin and turning her head toward the rose bushes. There in the hedge was a hole, a smoking, charred, empty place where the roses used to be. "Did you set it on fire?" Alice asked. Is that why they let me go?" "You set it on fire," Hatcher said. "I don't think the roses will trouble us any longer." At these words, he stood, still holding her in his arms, like a child. She never thought about how big and strong he was, but she was very tall, and he could hold her like she was nothing, a little bit of a thing. He approached the wall of the maze, and Alice turned her head into his chest, her eyes closed. "No," he said. "Look." She opened her eyes, just enough to see through the slits, and then opened them wider, astonished. The roses were curling back on themselves, rolling into tight little coils. Alice reached her hand toward the vines, her curiosity stronger than her fear. The roses shrank away from her touch, emitting that high-pitched squeal. They were afraid of her. Afraid of her. "A magician?" she breathed. "A magician," Hatcher said. "Perhaps," she said. It was wondrous, if it were true, but also terrifying. She wasn't prepared for this. "All right, then," Hatcher said and put her down. "Can you walk now?" Her legs were wobbly and her stomach heaved like she was seasick. Alice closed her eyes again and leaned on Hatcher's shoulder for a moment, breathing deep in through her nose. The reek of roses no longer pervaded the air. A fresh wind blew through the hedges, carrying with it the sweet, clean scent of grass. They started forward again, periodically checking the turnings as they did before. Alice did not feel at all steady. Her heart thumped rapidly in her chest, and though every rose moved away from them as they passed, it was difficult not to feel frightened. The flowers were cautious for now, but there was no guarantee that they would be in the future. She briefly considered trying to burn their way out of this maze. This was not a practical plan for two reasons. First, Cheshire might resent the destruction of his plaything. He was not their friend, but it did not seem he was yet their enemy. Alice did not desire to make an enemy of him. Then there was the question of how to burn the roses. Somehow she had performed magic twice, according to Hatcher, but on neither occasion was she certain how she'd done it. She was afraid that if she tried to light the bushes on fire and nothing happened, then the roses would know they had nothing to fear from her and attack. They walked, and the sun beat down, never changing position. There was no shadow cast by the maze, no place to hide from the continuous glare. They quickly drank all of the water Hatcher carried in his bag, and it was nowhere near enough. Alice removed her jacket and tied it around her waist, pushing the knife behind the belt of her pants. Hatcher followed suit, and Alice could now see how he kept all of his weapons in place. He had rigged a sort of harness. It reminded her of mules pulling carts, with many sheaths, and buckled it close to his body. The axe swung closest to his hand, near his waist, so he could grasp it at a moment's notice. Higher up, there were knives, big and small, and the gun that had frozen Cheshire's grin, if only for a moment. There was a line of gray sweat under the harness where it rubbed against Hatcher's shirt. Her own face and neck and chest were soaked, though her throat was parched. Still, the maze went on, with neither sight nor sound of water. After a while, Hatcher started muttering, "Rabbits and caterpillars and butterflies and carpenters," he said. "I'll cut through all of them like trees. Watch my axe swing wide and gleaming, and they all fall down, knocked down all the toy soldiers. Jenny." "Who's Jenny?" "Cheshire thought I knew her. Jenny. Jenny, she had gray eyes." Alice said, "You have gray eyes." Her tongue was swollen in her mouth, and the words didn't sound right in her ears. "Jenny," Hatcher said again, and he clutched both sides of his head. Alice saw his knuckles whiten, as if he were trying to squeeze the knowledge from his skull. "Jenny, Cheshire thinks he's so smart, but he has to sleep sometime. Oh yes, he must sleep sometime." Blood ran from Hatcher's left nostril as he spoke, over his lip and onto his chin, a torrent that made Alice still in alarm. She forgot how thirsty she was, how tired. "Hatch," she said, pulling on his arm, trying to make him stop crushing his head. "Hatch, stop." He tilted his head to one side, his eyes not recognizing her. "Are you Jenny?" "No, you're not Jenny. Your eyes are wrong." "Hatcher," Alice said, "come back to me." "She had gray eyes," he said. "Gray eyes. You're too tall to be Jenny. Stop pretending to be her." "I'm not Jenny," she said, trying to keep her voice firm and calm. "I'm Alice." "Not Jenny," he said, and then his right hand was off his head, and there was a knife in it. Alice released his arm and stepped back. "All right, Hatch, all right." She couldn't stop him from carving out her heart if he was so inclined. She knew she was no match for that blade or the hand that held it, so Alice moved away, walking backwards, her eyes on Hatcher and her hands high, fresh blood dripping on his shirt. "Jenny," he said again, and his voice had gone crooning. "My little mermaid swimming in the sea, my Jenny." He staggered to one side, caught his shirt on the thorns of the hedge. Alice's breath caught, but the roses did not twine around him. Hatcher tore loose from the thorns, stumbling forward. Then Alice heard it. Someone was singing in the most beautiful voice. Hatcher heard it too, for he stilled, turning his head in the direction of the voice. "This way," he said, and ran for the nearest junction in the maze, a few feet behind them. "Hatcher!" She was astounded. He had so much energy, his boot heels disappeared behind another turn, and she labored to catch up. "Hatcher!" The voice still sang, too lovely to be real and somehow not very nice. Alice thought. It was a little girl, thought. She knew, but it was also true. There was something cruel in that voice. For all its beauty, she rounded the corner where she'd last seen Hatcher and came upon a four-way intersection like a cross. "Hatcher!" she called again, running to each direction in turn, and finding nothing. Hatcher was gone. The voice stopped singing. Now panic was in her stomach and her heart and her mouth. She'd never been without Hatcher. Never all on her own. Not since the day he spoke to her through the mouse hole. What would she do without Hatcher? How would she get by? "Find him, you silly nit!" a firm voice said inside her head. That voice was disturbingly like Cheshire's. Alice did not like the notion that her mind would take on an identity of a person she disliked very much. "Use your wits and find him." "But how?" she said to herself as her eyes roamed all over, looking for evidence of Hatcher's passing. The grass was not flattened to show his boot prints. There was nothing to show where he'd gone. The sun was brighter than ever, blinding her, making her see dark spots when she closed her eyes, and bright yellow ones when she opened them. She rubbed at her face, blinking in glare, and looked down at her boots for a moment to shake off the sun. Next to her right heel was a tiny drop of red on a blade of grass, a little crimson jewel drying to brown. Alice dropped to her knees, her face very close to the grass. Her eyes searched ahead until she found another blade of grass carrying a red droplet, also rusting in the sun. She tucked her head low, her nose just above the grass, and scurried forward like a puppy smelling something good, following the intermittent stains of red in the grass. To the right hand turning. After a moment, she was certain Hatcher continued in that direction and stood again. Alice tried to run, but she was far too tired and thirsty to keep up the pace. She sensed that Hatcher was in danger, but could not force her weary body to move faster. "Hurry, Alice, hurry, hurry." She reached another junction with two choices and put her nose to the ground again. This time the blood was fresher, still jewel bright, and hope surged inside her. Perhaps she wasn't too far ahead. Perhaps she could still save him. But the singing stopped. That was worrisome. the lack of singing. To Alice's way of thinking, the singing was meant to draw them to the singer. If she, Alice thought, it sounded like a she, although it could be a turtle for all she knew, wasn't singing anymore, then that meant she'd gotten the thing she wanted. Alice did not want that thing to be Hatcher. The maze turned a corner ahead of her, and Alice followed it. Then she stopped and stared. Before her was a very large body of water. It was too large to be a pond, but too small to be a lake, and it was so blue it hurt the eyes. Alice could almost taste the water in her mouth. She wanted to dive in, let the water cover her until she drowned. In the center of the lake was a small island, and on the island was a tiny cottage painted like pink and white striped peppermint. There appeared to be no one on the island, and Hatcher was nowhere to be seen. "Hatcher!" Alice shouted. "Hatcher!" Then she saw it. There was a small pile of clothes close to the lapping water of the shore. More alarming was the stack of weapons on top of the dirty clothes. Hatcher's axe was there. Alice could not believe Hatcher would leave his axe behind. She sat on the beach and pulled off her boots and pants and jacket, leaving only the oversized shirt. Her knife was in her hand. As she dipped her feet in the water, it was cold, but the cold was refreshing. Alice again felt an overwhelming urge to sink to the bottom of the lake, and she shook her head from side to side to get that thought out of her mind. She knew Hatcher was in trouble, or else he would have answered her when she called. Still, she hesitated. Alice did not know how to swim. The only time she had been in water in the last 10 years was when she and Hatcher had jumped into the fetid river to escape the burning hospital. She knew she should kick and move her arms, but how would she keep herself afloat? And the impulse to sink beneath the water was very strong. The lake was clearly enchanted, and Alice wasn't certain she would have the concentration for swimming and fighting off the urge to drown. "I need to get Hatcher," she thought. She focused all of her will on the singular idea and hoped it would be enough. Alice waded into the water. She half expected something terrifying to rise from the water, a green monster with long arms to grab, or a silver-scaled dragon with razor-edged fangs. Her childhood picture books were full of creatures like these. Nothing disturbed the water, save Alice herself. There was only one thought in her mind: Hatcher. The water soon covered her knees and her thighs, and then the bottom suddenly fell away, and her head dipped below the surface. The drop was so abrupt that she didn't have time to take a breath. The water closed over her, so light and refreshing, after the sweltering heat of the maze. But she couldn't breathe. Her chest hurt from the strain of keeping air inside, and she sank very fast. Alice opened her eyes underwater, found that it was clear and utterly calming. The floor of the lake was not far from her feet. It was littered with skeletons. She kicked hard, then up and away, not wanting to touch the abandoned bones at the bottom of the lake. not wanting to become another victim of whatever lived in the candy-striped cottage. Her face broke the surface. She paddled just barely to keep her mouth and nose above the water. The cottage was not far. She only needed to go a little more. She gulped air and sometimes water, and the water was sweet and delicious like lemonade on a summer's day. She thought again that she might like to drift away to the bottom. Hatcher, she thought again, and kept thinking it. Hatcher, Hatcher. She struggled through the water, moving in tiny increments, and when her feet touched the sandy bottom near the cottage, she was surprised to discover she had made it there. Alice crawled out of the water. The shirt she wore was heavy from the lake, and it seemed to try to drag her back in. But her hands and knees moved forward, and her lips spoke over and over, Hatcher, Hatcher, Hatcher. Then her fingers were in grass instead of sand, and she struggled to her feet. The shirt dripping puddles around her. The knife Bess had given her was gripped in her right hand. The little house, white and red peppermint stripes, slashed across it, like blood, Alice thought, was perfectly still. The door was the only entry. There was no windows, no indication that anyone was home. Alice knew Hatcher was there, for he was not under the lake, rotting with the other bones. She opened the door, the red doorknob smooth beneath her. Hatcher was there, naked on the floor, eyes blank and far away. A woman with skin as luminescent as the moon crouched over him, her back to the door, all the bones of her spine showing through the skin. Alice did not stop to think. She took one step forward and plunged the knife in the woman's neck. The woman arched her back, her face curling up toward Alice. She saw that it was not a woman at all, but something from a nightmare. Something with long teeth like needles that curved over the chin and eyes as blind as an earthworm. The point of Alice's knife protruded just a bit from the creature's throat. Alice pulled the knife up hard, and blood the color of milk spurted out of the creature's mouth. Its arms stiffened out like wings, and it fell forward onto Hatcher, the white liquid pooling on his chest and stomach. Hatcher! Alice said, and pushed the creature off his body with her foot. He sat up, rubbing the back of his head and looking sheepish. I think she was going to eat me. I should say so, Alice said, averting her eyes. Hatcher had not intended to be naked before her. Hatcher stood, seemingly unashamed of his lack of clothing, and stared down at the creature for a moment. I wonder how long she's been here. Quite a while, if you consider all the bones in the bottom of the lake, Alice said. Hatcher blinked. Bones? Many, Alice said. Let's return to the other shore. We left all of our things there. They exited the peppermint house. An odd house for such a creature, Alice thought. There ought to have been a plump little witch inside, and walked to the shore of the lake. Hatcher waded in immediately. Alice followed with more reluctance. She had not enjoyed the crossing the first time. Hatcher turned around when he was waist deep. What's the matter? I can't really swim. Alice said. You made it here, didn't you? Hatcher said, holding out his hand. Let's go, silly girl. Alice smiled a little and put her hand in his. The water rose up in a giant wave, higher than any building in the city. Alice's mouth dropped open. Hatcher squeezed her hand tight and pulled her close just as the wave crashed over them. A moment later, all the world was rushing water and Hatcher's grip on her hand. Alice's head went under, bobbed up again, then repeated the process too many times to count. She couldn't see anything except waves, and couldn't hear a thing save the pathetic splashing she made to stay afloat. Hatcher never let her go, not even for a moment. She felt certain that at least they would be together whether or not they survived. She thought, I do not like Cheshire at all. The rushing river ended just as abruptly as it began. Alice and Hatcher slammed into hard cobblestone on their stomachs. Alice tasted blood in her mouth. She dropped her knife and wiped her eyes with her free hand. Hatcher had not loosened his grip on the other and looked blearily around her. They were in a dark alley, seemingly empty of people, with only a little light coming in at a far end. As her eyes adjusted, Alice saw a neat little pile of clothing in front of her and several weapons stacked atop, including Hatcher's axe and gun. Hatcher released her hand and knelt, inspecting the items as well as he could. Are they our things? Alice said. Did Cheshire send them with us? He just might be a magician after all, Hatcher said, by the way of answer. Best to cover yourself before someone comes along. They dressed quickly. Alice's pants and jacket and cap were dry, but the shirt was very damp. She wrung out the hem, pulling it around and away from her waist, and watching water dribble onto the stone. You'll have to pull the jacket closed, Hatcher said. Alice was thinking the same thing. The wet shirt made it much more apparent that she was not a boy she pretended to be. Her chest was small but noticeable when the fabric clung. Hatcher rummaged through the bag of supplies. There's food, pies from Nell and apples, and bread from Bess, Alice said. Hatcher shook his head. That food is gone. There's new food. He pulled out a cake shaped like a rose. Alice waved her hands. I don't want any food from Cheshire, she said. Probably wise. I have my money still. We can get something else. I'm hungry. Alice wasn't hungry at all. She supposed she ought to be, but everything that happened in Cheshire's house and maze crowded out thoughts of food. Was Cheshire really a magician, or had he simply learned to manipulate magic that was already there? The question you ought to be asking, are you a magician? She didn't feel like a magician. Some strange things had occurred around her, but she was hardly a practitioner of magic. Above all, she believed it was most important to make sure others did not think she was a magician. She and Hatcher had had enough trouble with the Jabberwocky and the rabbit. Bess had told her to stay away from the rabbit. Cheshire told her she'd taken out his eye, and that the rabbit had never forgotten her. As they went deeper into the old city, the possibility increased that they would encounter the man who danced through her nightmares for years. He would know her for certain, for Cheshire had known her by the scar on her face, and the rabbit was the one who put it there. Hatcher snapped his fingers in front of Alice. "Did you hear me, Alice? We have to find out where we are." "Yes," she said. She followed Hatcher, for she'd been standing still and staring into the distance, thinking about the rabbit and Cheshire and the Jabberwocky and cakes. Only the day before she'd been dreaming of yellow cake iced with pink sugar and cream, but the thought of Cheshire's rose-shaped cakes made her shudder and remember. 4 people around a table: Alice, Dor, the rabbit, and a man in the shadows. They were laughing. All of them were laughing so much because everything was so funny, and the rabbit told Alice she could have all the cakes she liked. She couldn't stop eating. The cake was so pretty, and there was plenty of it, and it made everything seem funnier than before. No one else was eating cake. They drank tea, and they smiled and laughed, but only Alice ate the cake. Dor had some biscuits on her plate. Little yellow biscuits, she said, tasted like lemons. Alice didn't want any biscuits. She could have biscuits at home. After a while, she felt sick and dizzy, her mother's voice in her head saying, "Too many sweets." She slumped in her chair, her eyes half closed. The man in the shadows took a slice of cake with purple frosting and put it on her plate, urging her to eat more. She didn't want any more. But he cut a piece with his fork and pushed it in her mouth. Crumbs spilled over her lips and onto her chin, and they all laughed again, all except Alice, who coughed and sputtered and took large gulps of tea. Who was that man? She couldn't see him. His hands were large, though, larger than both of her hands put together, and white as snow. No, not snow. Gloved. He had large hands, and he wore white gloves. Hatcher stopped at the end of the alley, and Alice bumped her nose in his back. That brought her to the present again. She peeked around his shoulder to see what made him pause. He gestured with his hand. Butterflies. And that is the end of chapter 9, my dear friends. Tune in next video for chapter 10 to see where exactly are they and where are they heading next. Will they be able to find the man that Cheshire mentioned? And will they run into the rabbit? Only time will tell. This has been Ruby, signing off.